This is the second half of our study of the book of Judges, and you can see here in chapter 6 that after 40 years of rest, Israel went back to evil practices, and they were hiding in caves after 7 years of oppression from the Midianites. So if we look down here in verse 11, the angel of the Lord comes to, and again, every time we see that term, we don't really know if, unless we carefully examine every context, whether it's Jesus or an angel. Usually angel of the Lord is the pre-incarnate Christ. So second person of the Trinity, whatever you want to call him. This is probably who it refers to, but I'll probably say messenger throughout. So, or, angel or messenger. So angel of the Lord came to where someone named Gideon was secretly threshing wheat, secretly because of the Midianites. And this angel greets Gideon by calling him a courageous warrior. But Gideon asks where God has been the last 7 years when they've been oppressed, though it should have been clear enough that they were reaping what they had sown. It's kind of ironic that he's there secretly threshing grain, has to do with reaping and sowing, and he didn't get the big picture of Israel having reaped what it sown. But anyway, you may recall that at the end of the previous lesson, I called Gideon an unlikely hero. And we see why in verse 15. He's the youngest member of the weakest clan in the half-tribe of Manasseh. So it doesn't get much more lowly than that in Israel at this time. So let's look down here at verse 17. And Gideon asked for a sign that he will indeed defeat Midian. And he is convinced through this sign that this was a real messenger from God. And after Gideon had tested the messenger, as God turned to test Gideon, and he tells him to pull down his father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole that goes with it for some reason. I don't know if those always went together, but it was fairly typical. And not only to pull those things down, but to replace them with an altar to God and then sacrifice a bull on it using the wood from the pole. So that's how you desecrate an altar. That's what you did every possible way to demean the defeated armies or country's God. You did things like that. So God is saying in no uncertain terms, this is Gideon's test to see what he really thinks of this pagan God of his own father. So if we look down here in verse 28, we can see that when the men of the area wake up the next morning, this is done during the night, of course, he's doing everything in secret because of the Midianites. And the next morning, the Midianites wake up and they find out that it was Gideon who did it. And so they demand that his father, Joash, hands him over to them to be executed. But Joash says something really bold and convicting. If Baal is a real God, let him execute Gideon himself. The one true God had done this many times, but of course people today hate him for it. I mean, this is how God proved who he is. He does things himself. He did the flood. He did the plagues of Egypt. And so what he's demanding here is that this fake God prove it the same way. Because people will object most of the time that Israel does things for God and God doesn't do them directly. But he has done it enough to prove his point. So that's the issue there. But then let's go down to 633. And after he passes this test, Gideon was given the Spirit of God, which points out an important difference between the age of grace and any other age before or after this. Only in this age, the age of grace, the church age, the body of Christ, does the Holy Spirit come upon a person and stay for life. Whereas before this time, the Spirit came and went on various people, and this is one instance of that. This is what turned Gideon into the courageous warrior, and he began to muster an army. And then in verse 37 is where we see the first literal instance of what people now call putting out the fleece to determine the will of God or to confirm it when we're not sure what God wants. This is where that phrase comes from. And then chapter 7, we come to the most interesting section of the account of Gideon. Though Midian's army was likely around 135,000, you can get this from various parts of the text. They had 135,000 troops, according to, especially if you go ahead to chapter 8, verse 10, it says how many were left after this battle. So you can piece it together. They have 135,000 troops. Gideon's army had about 23,000, and God said, it's too big. So, and the reason it's too big is because they might take credit to themselves for the victory. So you can read through that section about the steps that God takes to pare it down to a mere 300 soldiers. And then down in verse 9, God sends Gideon and a servant to eavesdrop on the enemy camp at night to hear what they're saying. And they go to this one place and they hear one of the soldiers tell about a dream that he had about their army's defeat. And it's clear that this dream was from God, just as Pharaoh and his baker and his cupbearer in Egypt had dreams from God, though they didn't worship him. These were unbelievers. These were pagans or heathens or whatever name you want to give them. And so were these Midianites. But God gave them dreams for his purposes. So just to put that as a note in your head. And then verse 15, Gideon roused his 300 soldiers during the night and divided them into 3 groups of 100 each to stand on 3 sides of the Midian army. And when they suddenly broke them, they had these jars with torches inside and they were carrying trumpets. And all at once, they broke their jars to reveal this light all of a sudden, kind of like turning on a spotlight on somebody in pitch darkness. And they blow the trumpets and shout, and the Midian army just panics and begins killing each other. And then they run away. So the lessons here for us, first of all, are that God continually picks the least likely heroes in our eyes. And second, that he can send dreams and visions even to unbelievers to carry out his plans. And third, that he can be trusted to work things out for those who trust him, which sounds suspiciously like Romans 8:28. God works everything for good for those who trust him. So this is what we can glean from that experience. And again, you should read through these things yourself. Then we're going to skip down a bit to chapter 8. And you can read the descriptions of all the stuff that I just talked about. And down to verse 22. I'll get there eventually. There we go. We can see here that the Israelites want to make Gideon king, but he refuses. Instead, he asks for gold, from which he makes an ephod, which was an article of priestly clothing with precious gems and metals in it, though it was also used in false religions. People think that this was unique to Israel, but it wasn't. Lots of people had ephods. I mean, the making of it was God's demand, and there's going to be overlap of the same kind of religious practices, but this is just one little detail anyway, and the thing is that what Gideon is doing with it, and it turns out that it became a false god to him and his family and his people, the whole nation. So then down in verse 27, you can see there that even though God allowed, in spite of this, God allowed Israel to have rest for 40 years while Gideon lived. And that's, of course, you'll see that 40 all over the place, especially in Judges here. There's lots of 40-year judging terms. But he did this out of mercy and patience because they were already back to evil practices. And this was Gideon. God, the one true God, just helped him defeat a much larger army, and he turns immediately to idolatry. Then we'll go down to chapter 9. And Gideon's son Abimelech decided to make himself the sole ruler of Israel by murdering all his brothers. So there's this lone survivor named Jotham, or Jotham, however you pronounce it. And let's look down in verse 8. And he gave the people a lesson in ingratitude by telling this story. You can read through it about the trees and the grapevine and all that. And it's a story of ingratitude and how they should, not only did Gideon and his family quickly turn to idolatry, but these people also turned on their own family. And so he utters this curse from God, may a curse be on, people who do things like that, killing off all his brothers. And then he took off before Abimelech was able to kill him. So down verse 50, I keep rolling the other side. They only sink if I roll the left side here. Skipping down to verse 50. And we can see here that we've skipped past the details of how God sets up to avenge Gideon's sons. And verse 50 is where it says the people of the city being attacked by Abimelech are all taking shelter in this fortified tower in the middle of the city. But when Abimelech comes near it, a woman drops a millstone, and this was an upper millstone. They said it weighed about 30 pounds from what I could tell, and it falls on him and shatters his skull. And so this was Jotham's curse coming true. But of course, we see also that being killed by a woman was humiliating, so he had his armor bearer running through with his sword so he could get out of that shame of on a technicality. Yet clearly everyone knew that a woman did it. I mean, here it is in the account. People knew who really killed him, and all the servant did was make the death quicker. This is just an example of how delicate ego is. I mean, this is pride in the flesh, and yes, these are unbelieving kings and all, but it's a common cultural norm. Through history, through culture, if anyone is bowing to culture, it's the people who promote this sort of flesh-based entitlement. But the thing here is an honor-shame society as well, and it was just, you just were the lowest of the low if a woman killed you, especially this is a battle. So totally embarrassing, and he thinks he's out of his embarrassment by having himself finished off by his servant, but that isn't fooling anybody. Anyway, down to chapter 10, verse 6. And, whoops, it scrolled a little too far here. I think I'm getting to verse 6. Here we go. We can see that Israel quickly goes back to its wallowing in the mud, and now God brings them against the dreaded Philistines. So this is a big deal in Israel history. Now let's try to go down to verse 11. And we can see that they cry out again, and this time God says, "Why don't you go whine to those gods you love so much?" But like a good parent with a very rebellious child, God can only stand so much of Israel's suffering, even though they deserve it. So along comes Jephthah, and this is a name better known to critics and anti-Christians than Christians, sadly. He's one of the names mentioned in Hebrews 11 as an example of people of great faith, even though his mother was a prostitute. We've seen that before, haven't we? Rahab, in the line of David, eventually, she was an innkeeper, but probably not guaranteed, but the likelihood seems to be that she was also a prostitute. But the thing is that this is also true, that we think, again, the people that we wouldn't pick are the ones God picks. Anyway, he picks the unlikely hero, the despised and rejected. This is his pattern. And his own half-brothers chase him off because of his mother. And he became something of a gang leader, if you read the description there. But when they need help to defend against the Ammonites, they come to him. And he reminds them of how they treated him. And it isn't clear whether they deny it or ask him to forget about it in verse 8. But he agrees on the basis of their pledge of loyalty. Then let's go down to verse 24. And taking a little time, sometimes it doesn't react right away. So in the ensuing war of words, Jephthah tells the enemy king to take whatever his god Chemosh gives him. He's mocking him. And reminds him as well that Chemosh waited 300 years to reclaim the land he says Israel stole from him. Does that sound familiar? I think there's been a lot of talk in the news over the last few decades about that sort of thing, people taking land that doesn't belong to them. Well, here is Jephthah saying, look, we've been living here for 300 years. That's longer than the U.S. has existed, by the way. And now they're saying, give it back. So we've seen in an earlier lesson that there really are no such things as indigenous peoples. And land has changed hands multiple times in history. That's the point, is that this is human history as people taking each other's lands. So we can't just pick and choose when we want that to be a problem. If we're going to criticize one nation for picking out, for being in occupying land that doesn't belong to them, then all of us have to move. And some of us got no place to go. And there are people who are extinct as a people group who used to have land before anybody else, supposedly, and nobody even knows that for sure. So it's impossible to identify an indigenous people. Anyway, that's an issue here. And then we'll go down to verse 29. And this is why Jephthah is known better by the critics. his foolish vow. In verse 31, he vows to God that he will sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house to meet him when he returns safely from battle, assuming, that God would give him the victory. And in verse 34, it reports that this turned out to be his only child, his daughter. So, he moans and cries, he made a stupid, foolish vow. And he is understandably grieved, but she takes it pretty well, actually. Of course, the critics rushed to presume she was burned and sacrificed because that's what he said he was going to do, assuming it would be an animal. Why he assumed that, I don't know, but he did. So the critics charge God with condoning human sacrifice. And this is the same mistake they make with Abraham and Isaac, who was, by the way, never sacrificed. Yet God's law forbade human sacrifice per Deuteronomy 18:10. And Hebrews 11, as I mentioned, would never have included him if he had done such an evil thing. And God would not have granted him victory knowing this would be the outcome. On top of that, we've seen that God will not hesitate to punish even someone like Moses for a less severe violation where he hit the rock instead of speaking to it. So why is Scripture silent about Jephthah if he had done such a thing as human sacrifice? This is how you rightly divide the word. You have to ask yourself a bunch of questions and check what data you have from the Scripture and look at what isn't said as well and consider it. Also notice the girl's request to mourn her virginity rather than her death and to spend her last 2 months away from her family. Why would she do that if she was about to be killed? And why would the text add verse 39 about her virginity if she had died, since many children die? And then verse 40 tells of the memorial the women of Israel celebrate for 4 days every year. Why would they not do this for all who died in childhood, or why would they want to keep a human sacrifice in public view? None of that makes sense if he actually sacrificed her. So all I can conclude from what the Scriptures give me is that he did not. She would just never marry. Why else make the big point about her being a virgin? And all of these issues are raised in an article I have linked in the description, and you can certainly find more on both sides of this issue. But at the very least, we can say there is no indisputable proof that God allowed a human sacrifice. So give that to the critics. Now we'll go down to chapter 13 and skip to the account of the final judge, Samson. Even though this is not the end of the book yet, he is the last one named as a judge. And God again comes to a childless, barren mother. I know that's an oxymoron, but she would turn out to be a mother. She's a barren woman, and she's going to be a mother because she gets this visit from God, or his messenger, and tells her that she's going to have a son, but she has this rule of that she's not allowed to touch anything alcoholic or any ritually unclean food until he is born. And when he is born, they're never to cut his hair because he will grow up to deliver Israel from the Philistines. And this is kind of like, I don't know if it's exactly like a Nazirite vow, but it doesn't say whether he ever touched alcohol, but while she was pregnant with him, his mother couldn't. So why did God appear to the mother instead of the father, though, is a question people, especially the likes of Constable that I used to quote, would say. Why would she, they would have a problem and they would have to hem and haw and find an excuse for this, like scraping the bottom of the barrel or so forth. Maybe there's something wrong with the father. Who knows? They would speculate over the place trying to cover up this embarrassing, ego-shattering fact that God is appearing to the mother, the woman, instead of the father. But the father, by the text, appears to have been a godly man by his reaction to what his wife tells him. So he's not the kind of person that God would not visit. He's actually better than most of them. Now let's go down to verse 10. And her husband prays that God will tell them how to raise the boy. He believes what his wife said. So he's a godly man. And he just wants to know, okay, how are we supposed to raise this special child? And the messenger or God returns with instructions. And this time he speaks to both of them. But notice verse 18. The messenger tells them not to ask his name because they wouldn't be able to comprehend it. What impact would this have on the sacred name movement? So this is clearly God by description. That 13:10 alone is telling you that this is not just an angel, okay, or not 13:10, but 18, sorry. So we can't comprehend the name of God. So the sacred name movement has nothing to stand on. Because, as I made a point in another earlier lesson, the Greek Septuagint always translate Yahweh as Kurios, Lord, Master, Sir. It has a semantic range like any other word. And God as Theos. And so if these were sacred names, the Septuagint would have transliterated them, and it didn't. So here again we see the sacred name movement simply cannot be valid because they can't even comprehend the sacred name. So now let's go down to 14, and we can see here that it won't turn out to be, in spite of the fact that God himself came to these people and confirmed that even though they had been childless, they're going to have a son, he's going to be special, he's going to rescue his people. But it's not going to turn out to be all unicorns and lollipops. This is Samson, after all, and if you know anything about it, maybe some true, some false, this is what we can expect. He grows up and decides that his parents must get him a Philistine woman he saw for a wife. And he doesn't care that she's not an Israelite. So, first problem. But as we see in verse 4, this is God's way of creating a pretense upon which to dispense with the Philistines who were ruling over Israel. So he's laying down plans, but why does God need a pretense? We can only guess, but that's what Scripture tells us. God is making a reason for a conflict so he can wipe out the Philistines. But if anybody wants to use this as a proof text against free will, let them explain why the Bible is filled with commands for people to choose wisely, or why they feel compelled to debate people about free will if people who disagree with them can't help it. Debating free will is the biggest oxymoron. It's the biggest self-contradiction, because if you don't have any free will, both of you are being forced to debate it. So why does anybody get upset? You're just puppets being up, the strings being pulled. So people who debate free will prove that they've already lost the debate. Anyway, God is making this pretext upon which to defeat the Philistines, at least partially. These things take time and different stages. But we'll go down to verse 5. And Samson goes to see the woman, but along the way he's attacked by this lion, which he tears apart with his bare hands by God's power. On his way home, he sees the lion carcass and a swarm of honeybees had built a nest in it, so he takes some of the honey out and gives it to his parents and doesn't even tell them where he got it. So it's kind of gross, but, I guess God is making a point, and we'll find out about that shortly. So finally the day comes for his wedding. And he takes his father with him to what is basically a bachelor party in the town where the woman lived and her family, and he didn't have any groomsmen with him or anything, so the father supplied a bunch of guys to be wedding guests. And during the party, and probably while he was inebriated, Samson gives the other guys a riddle to solve, and he offers them prizes if they do, prizes being fine clothing. I think he says 30 sets of clothing or something, but if they don't guess it in a certain amount of time, then they owe it to him. So, but they're running out of time by verse 15 here, the fourth day. So they decide to cheat and have his bride get the answer for him. And if she fails, they threaten to kill her. So she gets the answer from Samson and passes it on to the men who come to claim their prizes, but Samson knows they cheated. So he goes out and murders 30 men so he could take their clothes and pay the cheaters their prizes. So needless to say, the woman was married off to someone else, his best man. Who needs soap operas when we have quality drama like this? And by the way, this wasn't even the famous Delilah. We haven't met her yet. So here was this childless couple who's visited by God, given this special boy that they raised in special ways, and this is the way he lives. But God has his purposes. So we'll go down to chapter 15. And after some time passes, he's gotten over the incident, and he goes back there to claim his wife. And he doesn't know until he gets there that her father gave her to his best man. So now the hostility between Samson and the Philistines is totally escalated, with Samson what he does is he ties lit torches to the tails of jackals. The older versions have foxes, but it was jackals. And he sets them loose in the stacks of standing grain in the vineyards and just lets them, spread fire everywhere. And so, of course, then the Philistines retaliate and they burn his wife and her father to death. This is how things went in those days. You didn't talk so much. But anyway, down in verse 7, Samson, of course, avenges their deaths, and then he goes hide in a cave. And while he's hiding, the Philistines decide they're going to invade the tribe of Judah so they can find him. So they know about the area where he is, so they're going to attack Judah and rout him out. But the people of Judah say, we don't need to go to war, we'll go get him and bring him to you. So they didn't evidently care much for him. So they tie him up with some really strong new ropes, it says, and they hand him over. But we can see down here, verse 13, when he arrives where the Philistines are, he breaks the ropes like they're nothing, and then he grabs the jawbone of a donkey that was laying nearby and uses it as a weapon and kills 1,000 men. So down in 16, nice titles there we can see, and they're very helpful and accurate, I think. He goes to Gaza to hire a prostitute, but the Philistines find out about it and wait by the city gate to capture him. So again, this is not a high character. But he leaves in the middle of the night and not wait till morning like they expected, and he pulls the gates right out of the ground. So he doesn't care about locked gates. He just lifted them right up out of the ground. Now, is in verse 4, is where we meet Delilah. But instead of threatening her with death unless she finds out the secret of his strength, the Philistines offer her money. He isn't dumb enough to tell her the truth, so he keeps tricking her over and over, and she keeps trying, and then finally he snaps. And the male entitlement crowd will go, see, she's a nag. All women are nags. All women are like Delilah. I have heard that said. I've seen it written. All women are Jezebels, and we'll meet her later. Not in this study, but the fact is that these are nasty people on all sides. So using this as some kind of indictment of Christian women is just really, really bad logic and worse character on the critic's part. Anyway, in verse 15, she realizes somehow that he has finally told her the truth about the secret of his strength being in his long hair. So she lulls him to sleep. They cut off his hair and then they gouge out his eyes. Nasty people. But God chose him. He knew how this would turn out. If God didn't believe in free will, then Samson wouldn't have done any of this stuff. But even though God chose him and knew this was going to happen, nothing says that God told him to give away the secret of his strength either. So God isn't making him do these things. But he's working through it. He picks people knowing how they're going to react, and his purposes are achieved without violating free will, which is not an easy thing to accomplish. And this is, in my opinion, the dilemma that Satan thought he had God in by making Adam and Eve sin, that God would be stuck between a rock and a hard place, because on one hand, if he just forgot about the sin and let them live out of compassion, then he would be unjust. And yet, if he just let the human race die and go under the control of Satan and never look back, he would be unloving. So God's solutions were always a surprise to Satan, and of course the ultimate solution, and we can read about that in the New Testament, was a deliberate, total surprise, because God kept it hidden so that certain things would happen, and that's why you don't see the church in the Old Testament, but more about that some other time. So they've got Samson subdued, they blinded him, and then we'll go down to verse 23, and they decide that after a long time has passed, they're going to have this celebration in the temple of their god Dagon. And by the way, Dagon was a fish god, and if memory serves, I may be mistaken, but I'm thinking this was also the god of, who Jonah went to visit. So anyway, they worshipped fish god too. Dagon was a fish god. And there's a study I've done on YouTube of Babylon, and you'll find that this is where the idea of hats that are shaped like fish heads came from. But more about that some other time. Anyway, this is Dagon, the fish god that the Philistines are worshiping, and they're in the temple having this great party, and they send for Samson to make fun of him. But his hair has had time to grow back, and they make the mistake of placing him between the two main supporting pillars of the temple, where the rulers and over 3,000 people were gathered. So he prays one last time for God's strength, and knowing he will die with his enemies, but God grants his request, and that's, who can say, it was Samson's choice, but God gives him his request and lets him die with his captors, and this is how he takes out the leadership of the Philistines. So, and by the way, it was Nineveh. Couldn't think of that word for the life of me, but where Jonah went. Anyway, look up Dagon, the fish god, sometime. So now, Samson's gone, and the Philistines' leadership is decimated. But starting in chapter 17, the rest of the book mostly is not so much about judges, but just general events that are being recorded. But it's interesting, we go down to chapter 19 and verse 11, and we can see that they call Jerusalem. This is the first time we've seen Jerusalem mentioned before, but here it's called by a shortened name, Jebus, which is used by anti-Christians as a mocking name for Jesus. They use that when they're just, mocking and disrespecting. And so we could all educate the ignorant critics that they've been talking about Jerusalem this whole time. So there it is in the Bible, Judges 19:10. So there it is. That's the Hebrew text, and it's the same with an I, Yebus, or Yevus, depending on which. And this would be Older Greek, so it's probably more of a B sound. But there you go. Fun fact. So down in verse 15, though, there's a very disturbing event that takes place in a place called Gibeah. It's very much like Sodom and Gomorrah, but it's in the area of the tribe of Benjamin. And this city demands to rape a man who is a Levite who has taken shelter for the night in the local resident's home, just like Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot was visited by the angels who came to get him out of there, and that's what the men of that city did. So this is a Levite. That doesn't mean he was a priest necessarily, but he was of that tribe. Okay, and a lot of people, you'll read commentators about this concubine of his, and they will say that she had been unfaithful. But the truth is, if you go investigate it, that the text tells us that doesn't make any sense, because she ran away from this Levite back to her father's house, and if she had been unfaithful, she would have been put to death. But she wasn't. And there's enough ambiguity, at least in the text, to say that she was simply angry with him. That is to say, the Levite was not a nice guy, and she took off and got away from him. And we'll find out this is a very likely meaning rather than that she had been unfaithful, because we'll find out how he treats her. So she was right to run away from him. But you know how the commentators are. They'll want to say, well, she was unfaithful, so she deserves what she's about to get. But even the most cold-blooded monster would kind of, I think, hesitate at this payback. This is way out of line. Even if she had been unfaithful, she was supposed to be stoned to death, and that's a far more humane death than she was about to experience. So, as with Lot, who I think was bluffing, as I mentioned in that lesson, we look down here in verse 22. The host offers to send out his own virgin daughter to the wicked mob who is demanding to rape the Levite, because to that culture it was far better than failing to protect a guest in their home. As long as the guest was a man, apparently nobody cared about the women, but men guests were to be protected at all costs. The host was supposed to protect with his life. Women simply didn't matter to them. But it was the Levite who grabbed his own concubine and threw her out to them. So yeah, she should have run away from him, and she did. She tried, and he had eventually went back to her father's house to get her and try to win her back, and everybody's happy. They have a nice time for a few days, and they're traveling away from her father's house when this happens. She would have been better to stay there. But he threw her out to them, and they abused her all night long, this whole group, and she wasn't even checked on till the next morning when he opens the door and finds her on the doorstep, and all he could say was, "Get up, we're leaving." That is cold-blooded. But she didn't budge because she was dead, so he put her over a donkey and went home, and then he carves up her body into 12 pieces and sends them out to the tribes of Israel to see what they want to do about it. So this was his fault. This was totally his fault. And she was right to run away from him. And we find it difficult to read about such cruelty, especially even after she's dead, to cut her up and throw her, send her pieces in the mail to the 12 tribes to get them to go to war. We have a difficult time reading about this stuff, but too many women can testify to this and more in our lifetime. So people are pointing fingers, but wait a minute. Here we are 2,000 years since Jesus came, and even many in the Western world in the church still treat women as worse than animals. So again, I ask, can those who promote the submission of women not see their own culpability in such an attitude? That's where these things come from. There have been right-to-life organizations, totally against abortion, which is a good thing to do, who teach that all women are temptresses and Jezebels who need to be kept under the control of a man at all times. I don't see how the Pharisees could have been this hypocritical and heartless. Jesus said that defilement comes from within us, and it's impossible to deny the slippery slope from the subjugation of women in practice and in theory to the abuse of women. Treating women as equal adults cannot be blamed for abuse. Abuse happens among equals. I'm not denying that. What I am saying is nobody can point to the teaching of women's inferiority and use that as an excuse, because many men have done that, especially Christian men. The teaching of hierarchical gender roles is often given as the excuse when a man is arrested for abusing a woman. Yes, there are women who abuse men, and there are parents who abuse children, but that's never been enshrined as God's natural order. The Christian community should be ashamed and will be judged accordingly for this teaching. Now to chapter 20. And the critics, of course, think that if the Bible simply reports something, then God must approve with this murder and chopping up. But again, we must understand that such reporting of the most heinous crimes proves that the Jews did not invent any of this. This isn't whitewashed history. Even so, when the Levite tells what happened, he gathers, he sends those body parts out and they all come together for war, and he tells them what happened. He fails to mention that he's the reason the woman died at all. But the result is that Israel's ready for war. So he just left out that little detail that he was a total jerk, to put it mildly, and she ran away from him, and he convinced her to go back to him. Never do that, ladies. And that resulted in her death. Her horrible, torturous death and dismemberment. And then the guy who did it doesn't even take responsibility, and nobody holds him to account except God, because here it is all recorded in living color for thousands of years later. So God finds out, people find out, and if people get away with things in this life, they won't get away with it in the next. I can guarantee you that. And Jesus said the last will be first and the first will be last. So those people who claw for the first place in line, as I mentioned before in an earlier lesson, are going to find themselves at the end. There's a story told of a classroom of children who were told to line up for some good candy or something. And of course, the bigger, stronger, more aggressive kids push their way to the front of the line. And when they're all in a line, the teacher says, okay, about face, everybody turn around where you're standing. And so the pushy kids were at the end of the line and got the worst pick. That's what God's going to do. So anyway, the Levite leaves out that detail and gets Israel ready for war. But remember, this is all in a time when Israel has repeatedly chased after other gods. None of these are nice people. So we go down to verse 12. And they all go as a group to confront the whole tribe of Benjamin. In other words, again, we see the group is being held responsible for the individual. And they demand that they hand over the men who did this rape and murder. Actually, it should have been the Levite, but they refuse to hand them over. So they condone this thing. They don't care. And there's a battle, and the whole tribe is nearly wiped out. I think it says that there was like 600 men who survive. But this final chapter, 21, let's get down to there. There's the 600. Tells of another disturbing event, a solution only a culture like that could think of. They preserve the defeated tribe's inheritance by helping the surviving men kidnap a bunch of virgins and take them as their wives. Again, the women don't count. They don't have any choices. Nobody thinks this is a problem. These Israelites and their legal loopholes. This, because they had made, if you read the section there, they had made this vow that they would not give their daughters as wives to the Benjaminites ever. So they said, what are we going to do? We've wiped out a tribe of Israel. How are we going to find wives for these 600 men survivors? And so they said, I know. There's these people are going to have a celebration, and the women will come out to dance. The virgin women will come out to dance, and then you just snatch them. So we didn't give them to you. You took them. It's a technicality. So this, in my opinion, this time of the judges should be renamed the time of insane inhumanity, though in fairness, it pales in comparison to other cultures. This isn't the worst of the worst, but it's way worse than any Christian should ever tolerate. And yet, as I mentioned, Christians not only tolerate but condone. And you can see, as I said in the commentaries, how they think that the concubine who was thrown to that mob of rapists and then dismembered, that she deserved that somehow because she had been unfaithful. And none of that is true. But that's what the Dr. So-and-so commentaries will tell you. Think for yourself. Read the scriptures, study them like Bereans, and ask for the Holy Spirit's guidance, because if you let prejudices like that are time-honored for thousands of years across all the cultures, if you let those blind you, you will remain blind and you will be responsible, because God won't let you get away with it. So every Christian has it incumbent upon them to study carefully on their own before they go consulting other people, and make sure you ask enough questions. That's what cross-examination is. None of us would want to be condemned on the basis of having the prosecution say something, the defense say something, and then the judge says guilty or not guilty on the basis of, one round. There's supposed to be, in a fair trial, multiple cross-examinations. The prosecution and defense go back and forth until the jury and everyone is satisfied with that they've heard all the sides, and then they can make a decision. But Christians don't do that. People in general don't do that, but especially Christians should know better. Cross-examine every teaching so that we don't become rationalizers like today's Christian leaders and commentators.